I realize that every professional group has a special concern when they attend such a seminar as this with the practical application to their specific jobs of the ideas that are being discussed. And the question has been put to me very concretely that if I'm discussing the human game and promulgating some sort of philosophy of life as play, how will you get this across to your clients, your students, your patients, etc., however you name them? And I want to assure you that this is the one subject on earth that you should not be concerned with. Now, I very often talk to all sorts of groups, and in these groups there are invariably parents, and they hear about this sort of point of view and they want to know how to apply it to their children, as if children were certain things that you apply something to. Children are very canny, and the moment you start applying a method to them, they're aware that something's afoot. And the only way to do anything at all with children is to be natural, to be you. But there's no way of doing that, because the moment you know you're being natural, you're not. If you, however, are a person fascinated with something, deeply interested in anything at all, it doesn't matter what the devil it is. A child is intrigued, catches the infection of it from you by osmosis. And so in exactly the same way, if you are deeply absorbed with life, you can commit psychotherapy without any technique at all. Only there are rituals which bring you into contact with people. You know, they have to make an appointment and they have a problem and they want to discuss it with you. And so that has to be tolerated. But beyond that, what they really want to meet is a person whose own life is really satisfactory to him or her, rather than a person who is a professional in setting other people's lives right. There's no way of doing that. And so, the thing that I want to talk to you very seriously about, or very sincerely, about certain things that seem to me important in the life of anybody in your position, and certain things that are ordinarily quite out of the bounds of psychiatrists and psychologists' discussions. Speaking quite frankly, the thing that oppresses me in my constant contact with psychotherapeutic circles is the amazing superficiality of it all. You know, let's be psychologists, and let's not venture any deeper than that. Let's be quite clear that we are working with something empirical, something matter of fact, and let's not get anything really spooky mixed up with this. Because after all, we are, as I explained earlier, we are still under the influence of the 19th century mythology of the world. And this has become a tremendously important thing for all those branches of the academic profession that want to be scientific and aren't. Now, science is a discipline possible only in very, very special situations. The nature of science is the accurate description, first of all. And accurate description is possible only when the subject matter to be described is very carefully limited and restricted. In other words, in situations where all the important factors are measurable. And in order, say, to have a test tube containing certain chemicals which need to be measured with extreme accuracy, you've got to isolate this test tube from the external world. If the mixture is in any way unstable, a passing truck might damage things, a subtle alteration of temperature when the sun comes out might upset something. And so more and more you have to isolate your specimen in an influence-proofed room. And that's a very expensive and a very difficult thing to construct. But once you've done it, when you've got all the variables in the situation are known and measurable, you can have some approximation to a truly scientific experiment. To pretend to be able to do this in human relations is absurd. Your variables are infinite. You've no real idea what they are. But that is not to say, in any sense whatsoever, that therapy cannot be performed, and that you, as psychologists consulting schools, cannot do your jobs. I only ask of you, don't sail under false pretenses. Don't assume the mask of science. Don't aspire to the status of being scientists in the sense that a physicist or a chemist or a mathematician can be scientists, with their rigorous precision and their elimination of variables. You, if you are successful, must be artists. And an artist is a person who performs certain things skillfully, but doesn't really know how he does it. You learn art by methods that you don't know how you learn. You can't describe. Because your brain is capable of absorbing all kinds of information that is much too subtle to be translated into words. You see, we're doing an enormous, in the academic world today, we're doing an enormous number of studies on creativity. How do we get creative people? Couldn't we somehow pin this down and try and analyze and specify the factors which lead to creativity in engineering, in inventive work, in psychology, anything you want? Well, it's fun doing that. It's all right to analyze creativity and see if you can make any sense of it, but you won't. But that doesn't deny the fact that creativity exists and can indeed be stimulated. Creative people can stimulate creativity in others by osmosis, by exposure. And so, as a form of creativity, also the power of psychotherapy can be learned, provided you do not pretend it is a science and that there is a specific method for learning it. It can be learned, provided you expose yourself to a therapeutic person. You don't know, do you, how you digest vitamins? You don't, when you take these pills, have to know the precise steps by which they are turned into your life energies. Your body knows how to do it. But that's not a process analyzable into words and figures. So in exactly the same way, through certain kinds of human contact with people who have the gift of therapy, you can absorb their wisdom like you absorb the virtues in vitamins. But don't be anxious about it and try to define the whole thing. I remember when I was a little boy, I once thought the idea that I would write a book which would pass down all knowledge to a subsequent civilization that would know nothing about us. And the first thing I had to do was to write down how the letters of our alphabet were pronounced. Figure that one out. Now, I made a way of saying how A was pronounced, but I had to use A to show how A was pronounced. And that is that is an epitome of the problem that we have. You can't say in words how words are used. And so, do you know a game called Vish? What you do is everybody has a standard college dictionary, Webster's College Dictionary. You sit around a table, and then there's a hat, and you pull out, somebody pulls out a word, and everybody looks the word up. Then they write down on a pad the key words and the definition of that word, and then they start looking them up. And the first person who gets back to the original word calls out Vish, short for vicious circle, and he wins the round. And the referee, there's always a referee, he decides whether you worked fairly, whether you didn't take an illegitimate shortcut, you know, like looking up and or something like that in the definition. You have to look up a key word, because so long as a dictionary doesn't include pictures, all it does is define words in terms of words. It never makes the bridge between words and the physical universe, which Korzybski so delightfully called the unspeakable world. So fascinating. Unspeakable also means disreputable. The world that is not academically respectable. Do you know that in recent controversy at Harvard about the experiments with psychedelic drugs, some member of the Department of Social Relations actually said no knowledge is academically respectable knowledge unless it can be expressed in words. Completely throws out the football team. You know, did you ever hear of the football team doing a thesis on how to play football? Obviously not. Because that's something that has to work. Notice, too, in the academic world that all subjects which are effete are studied in terms of their history. When you start studying mathematics, you do not study the history of mathematics as you initial course, but history of philosophy, history of religions is the start-out course in these topics. Medicine, you don't start studying the history of medicine until you're in graduate school. History of science is a graduate school subject. History of psychology. Whenever you think a subject is practical, you go right into doing it, rather than being historical about it. But the point simply is that you cannot pretend to be scientific and to adopt the gestures and attitudes and postures of scientists about things that are arts and that require a certain kind of personal magic, profundity, or whatever to carry them off. And so I would say that the thing that affects me and depresses me about the whole world of psychiatry, psychology, and psychotherapy is a certain extraordinary lack of depth, and almost bending over backwards not to encounter anything profound, because that would expose us to the charge of mysticism or some other bugbear. But this is quite fatal, because what your patients are concerned with is profound things. Have you ever looked into the literature on the relation between psychotherapy and death? You will find a lot of blank pages. There's hardly anything about it. I know of 2 books, and I don't know how many articles. I'm not in the habit of reading articles very much, but so far as books are concerned, I know about 2 books outside of the work of Freud, where he discusses death wishes and so on, and outside the work of Jung, who has said that he regards his kind of psychotherapy in particular as a task for the second half of life in which a person prepares for death. But by and large, ordinary psychotherapeutic work ignores the subject. Likewise, the whole orientation of medicine to death is one where death is a misfortune. It's not allowed to happen. Doctors don't prepare people to die. When somebody is in a state of terminal cancer, all their friends come around and say, "Cheer up, old boy, you'll be all right in another 2 weeks, and we'll be back and having a beer again, or we'll go out to the country and you'll be back at work. Love to see you in the office once again. This person knows jolly well you're going to disappear within a couple of days." And knows this and feels the strange mockery of his friends' unwillingness to accept this, and therefore a lack of genuine human relationship. And so the physician is embarrassed in a way that maybe a priest is not embarrassed. When somebody says to him, "Listen, I am sick of being ill, I want to die. I want to stop all this stuff being fed into my veins, and I want to be through." And the doctor in his role can't say, "Of course, that's perfectly understandable." And insofar as the psychotherapist takes his cue from medical role-playing, he can't say to a person, "All right, you should die." I think it's a good thing. A very wise man once said, this was Ananda Kumaraswamy, "I would rather die 10 years too early than 10 minutes too late." There's a time to die. And dying should be one of the great events of life, like birth and marriage, graduation, anything like that. No, all cultures have had the rites of passage. But in our culture, death is a very strongly repressed event. We call it passing away. And our morticians, who call themselves that instead of undertakers, make up bodies in the mockery of a beauty sleep. And they have a kind of oily, unctuous, avuncular approach, which is extremely beastly. And they make a huge racket out of the whole thing. You know, the fantasies about Forest Lawn, which is the epitome of all this kind of thing. Henry Miller's one, I was quoting to someone at dinner, where he says, "Swallow a dozen vitamins and throw anything down the hatch. If that doesn't work, see a surgeon. If that doesn't work, get a Hollywood funeral." They're the duckiest, cutest, craziest funerals in the world. You could have your beloved embalmed and sitting on a couch, reading something edifying like the Bhagavad Gita and smoking a cigarette. Cigarette guaranteed not to run away before the lips and the buttocks. "O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?" And this, you see, because the healing professions today are working on the basis, the metaphysical basis, of that 19th century scientific mythology, that this world is nothing but a mechanism. And that when you're dead, as people love to say and lick their tongues around it. As if that really said anything at all. And so what we are reduced to is, on the matters on which we are fundamentally embarrassed, we carefully keep silence. We have no answers about that. We'd rather not talk about it, but it's a thing people are fundamentally fascinated with. Now you can rationalize all you want and say that questions about the ultimate meaning of the universe have no meaning. You can be as logical positivist as you please, but that will never quash the questions. And a person who doesn't somehow have a sense of relationship with whatever it is that's eternal will rattle rather than speak. And so I would say to you, talking frankly here tonight, that the most important thing for any kind of psychologist or therapist is not religion in the old sense of this word, because religion is something in our world partisan. Are you a Catholic or a Baptist, a Methodist or an Episcopalian? You deal there, you see, in those, in our sectarian religion, with things that are beliefs, and therefore not knowledge. These are expressions of opinions and hopes, but they're not. These religions have no power because they have no knowledge, they have no experience. In fact, they hate experience. If you try and discuss, as I did when I was a minister in the Anglican Church, problems of mystical experience, most clergy will say you're a nut. Because they will say that's all subjective. And what matters is, do you adhere to a certain standard of traditional doctrine or behavior? That's objective. That's something we have out there, see? When it comes to experience, actually, knowing something in your bones, they're scared out of their wits. And I said this afternoon, the same thing is true in psychiatrists. The psychiatrist is terrified to experience something outside the banalities of ordinary everyday consciousness. And as I said, he clings to that with a peculiar passion. You know, I remember once I was undergoing an LSD experience, and the psychiatrist in attendance, he wasn't a bad fellow at all. I mean, he was a very imaginative man, but he said, what are 5 and 7? What are 9 and 3? No, but I still negotiate these mathematical trivialities. And these are tests of sanity. Now, I don't want to deride that completely, because anybody who explores into worlds beyond the everyday world should be able, ideally, to come back with an account of what he's seen. I believe very much in being a bridge between worlds and being able to put into intelligible and rational language things that come from experiences beyond the intelligible and rational. That's the task of a poet. A poet is supposed to be a person who says what can't be said. At least he's always approximating to that. In a way, nothing can be described. except to those who already know what it is. You know what I mean by water because you've tasted water and seen it. If you had never seen water, you wouldn't know what I meant by the word. On the other hand, what will I do with a person who is congenitally blind and he's never seen light and doesn't know what color is? I'm going to make a hell of an attempt to describe it to him. I'm going to exercise all my wits and say, look, there is something like what you experience as different degrees of temperature. You know what hot is? You know there are many degrees from hot to cold. Now there's something else like that. We talk about hot and cold colors, reds and blues. And they're at different ends of a spectrum, which is like you experience between hot and cold, or between rough and smooth. But this thing also is like what you hear in sound. You hear high and low notes, and you can see a whole range of different tones between them. Now there's something else in which these things happen, and it's a sense you don't have, and so I can't tell you directly, but it's like all that, and I can really work on it. Give him an idea of something else. He won't get it directly from my talking, but he will, through the conviction with which I'm speaking and through the care with which I'm trying to outline this to him, know that there is another dimension beyond his imagination. And so in just the same way, there are dimensions beyond the imagination that our ordinary academic education gives us. It would be all right if we were as definitively excluded from them as people who are congenitally blind are excluded from color and light, but we're not. We keep slipping in and out of them, sometimes in a way that is beneficent, and sometimes in a way that is deeply troubling. When a person who is brought up in Arkansas and has no other religion than the fundamentalist interpretation of the King James Bible slips accidentally into a mystical experience, no other way to describe what has happened than to say that he is Jesus Christ or God. This is blasphemous in his community. But to give him the benefit of the doubt, they say he's crazy. And whenever somebody says such a thing, we challenge them in our culture with technical questions. If you are God, command that this glass be made into a rabbit. How did you create the universe in 6 days? There was once a poor woman in an asylum who was asked this question, and she replied, "I never talk shop." But there it is, you see. These states do occur, and psychology and psychiatry can do nothing with them except call them aberrations, unless psychiatrists and psychologists have themselves explored these experiences. Why should we pursue them? Because you have to deal with them. And because what is always being asked of you is, you see, people go to you today, whereas before they went to clergymen. The clergyman is a pretty hopeless case today. Because people feel that if they go to him with a real problem, all they'll get is platitudes. Especially if it's a moral problem of any kind, he'll be understanding. They know that because he's been to a modern theological school where they had courses in pastoral psychology and counseling. But they know fundamentally that a clergyman is out to get you. He wants to enroll you in a community, in a church, and so that you'll be a regular contributor. They have a little bit more confidence in a doctor or somebody associated with doctoring because they know a doctor wants to get rid of his patients. A doctor doesn't want to get you hooked on medicine if he's an honest doctor, but a clergyman wants to get you hooked on the religion. So you people who stand midway culturally are looked to because you have the aura of science. And therefore people say, well, that's rather more objective, that's a little safer. I feel I can risk this person because he's not out to get me into some hocus pocus. See? So I'm afraid of that clergyman because eventually, however understanding he is, he's going to wag his finger at me and say, naughty, 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 you mustn't do that. Especially, see, in effect today, our churches are nothing but sexual regulation societies. That's all they're interested in. They get a little bit riled up about race relations. But fundamentally, what can you get kicked out of a church for? That's the test. Especially if you're a minister. You can live openly in envy, hatred, malice, and all uncharitableness, hardness of heart and contempt of God's word and commandment, and be a bishop. But the moment you sleep with your secretary, and furthermore continue to do so, you're out, out, out. If you're a homosexual, it's even worse. That's the test. That's what it's all about. Well, let's reserve questions to a little later, and then we can take them all together. But over and over again, this is the thing that matters. So people who, for various reasons, are involved in a form of love or sexual relationship, which is by these standards irregular, they know that when finally they get down to it with the minister, he's going to say naughty, naughty, naughty. And so it goes. So they don't go. Because he stands as pure square. However softly he puts it over, the soft sell. But they know with the psychotherapist they're going to get some less judging and more understanding attitude. But they will pursue the psychotherapist to a certain extent and find that beyond a certain point he collapses because he doesn't know what to do with death. He has no metaphysical ground. The priest has too much metaphysics and he has no understanding on the level of that the psychotherapist has competence in. So therefore, to be truly effective, the psychotherapist needs a kind of deeper vision. And he hasn't any reason to be afraid of it and to be feeling that this will injure his scientific respectability. Because as I've given you the clues this morning, you don't need to talk about mysticism. You need to talk about ecological awareness. There is always a language you can translate this into that will placate behaviorists, logical positivists, and other people who want to insist fundamentally that the universe is Tao. You see, that's what lies behind all these mythologies. The person who wants to say on the one hand that the universe is something that strikes him as profoundly mysterious will talk about the Godhead and things behind it. The person who, on the other hand, who wants to say, oh, well, it's just thing that's not really very important. He'll find a language so as to describe the universe in a slightly contemptuous way. He'll say it's nothing but. And neither of these people can prove that what they say is true. They're just two different ways of expressing the kind of person you are, or what role you're playing with respect to life. See, a lot of people want to advertise the fact that they are sound and reliable, and nobody can put over any nonsense on them. They're tough-minded. In the academic world, they'll always play a certain role. You can watch it, you know exactly what it is, how they come on. Other people want to say to those people, you're dry as bones, you rattle, you know the words, but you don't know the music. You see, all these people really are differentiated between two schools of thought. The prickly people and the gooey people. And on the side of goo, we have the romanticists, and on the side of prickles, the classicists. In medieval times, on the side of goo, we had people who were then called realists, and on the side of prickles, the people who were called nominalists. Now, realists believe that every man, individual person, was an example of an essence called mankind. The realists said that's a lot of nonsense. There are only particular people. There is no such essence called mankind. And today, the logical positivists and behaviorists are examples of prickly people, and mystics and idealists in the Berkeleyan sense are examples of gooey people. And this is an eternal debate. When you examine any substance closely, you find structure. But when your lens gets out of focus, you find substance or goo, because you can't see the details. So it is all homogeneous, like homogenized milk. So depending on the level of magnification with which you look at life, you see prickles or structure, and goo or stuff. And all philosophical debates go along between these people. Whereas the truth of the matter is, of course, that life is gooey prickles and prickly goo. Now, don't get taken in by being too prickly. This is the thing that in our academic world today, in considering what its fashions are, is the besetting temptation. To secure oneself as an honest and respectable academician who is of sound scientific approach. People who ought not to be so prickly, because they're dealing with things in which there are infinitely many variables, put on the idea that they know what all the prickles in this psychological situation are, and we just don't. You have to get a bit gooey. And don't be ashamed of it. So then, we have to consider mythology. We've looked at myths, now 2 myths, which have been so influential on our culture. And one myth was an authoritarian, paternalistic one, that we are under God. We are the subjects of a divine king who acts towards us in the role of a cosmic grandfather. This was all rather uncomfortable. And so, as I pointed out, there's a reaction in this. Look, the universe isn't interested in us at all. It was too interested in us, you see, with the God the Father myth. So the reaction to that is that it's not a bit interested. Nature cares nothing for the individual, only for the species. You know that story. I invite you to consider another myth, and I say myth, which is, of course, the famous Hindu myth that the universe is a drama. During the last two sessions, I've been talking to you principally about the philosophy of the Lao Tzu book, the Tao Te Ching, and now I want to shift today over to Zhuangzi. This Zhuangzi, so far as we know, lived about 300 BC, maybe a little earlier than that. And he is a very, very remarkable person because the Zhuangzi book, he's also, more exactly, his name is Zhuangzi. But his book, sometimes called simply the Zhuangzi book, is quite unique in the whole history of philosophy, because he's almost the only philosopher from the whole of antiquity who has real humor. And therefore he's an immensely encouraging person to read. But part of his humor is the art of exaggeration. And you always have to allow for that. You always have to realize that he's slightly pulling his own leg. He is, as in a group of people who are enthusiasts for something, but have humor, you very often find that when they're talking among themselves, they carry their own ideas to ludicrous extremes and roar with laughter about it. And Zhuangzi does that. Now, for example, he has a great deal to say about the value of the useless life. The whole notion of something of life, any moment in life or any event in life being useful, that is to say, serving the end of some future event in life, is to a Taoist absurd. Because nothing is useful at all. The universe is viewed as purposeless and useless through and through, because it's a game. More than that, game doesn't really convey the sense of this. When a Taoist sage is wandering through the forest, he isn't going anywhere. He's just wandering. When he watches the clouds, he loves them because they have no special destination. He watches birds moving around. He watches the waves lapping on the shore. And just because all this is not busy in the way that human beings are busy, because it serves no end other than being what it is now, it is for that reason that he admires it, and it is for that reason that you get the peculiar styles of Chinese painting in the Tang, Song, and later dynasties, where nature, in its wayward, wandering nature, is the main subject. When we say that something is without purpose, that's a put-down phrase. Say, well, it's no future in it. What's the use? No, we say, what's the use? And we need very much to realize that that question reflects our insanity. What's the future? What's the use? The joy for the Taoist is that things have no use, and the future is not important. Now you can exaggerate this, and Zhuangzi does in a very humorous way, by describing the ideal useless man. He's a hunchback, and he's so deformed that his chin rests on his navel, and so on, and But he says now this man is very admirable. He's found the secret of life because when the social service workers come around, he's the first to get a free handout. And when the military officers come around to conscript people for the army, he's the first to be rejected. Therefore, he lives long. Then he also describes the case of some travelers came across an enormous tree. Fantastic thing. And they said, never did anyone see such a tree. So they went up and looked at it. At first they tested the leaves and found that they were rough and disagreeable and no good to eat. Then they looked at the branches and found that they were all twisted and absolutely no good for using as sticks. Then they examined the wood and found it was full of pith and absolutely useless for a carpenter. So nobody had disturbed this tree. It was not used for cutting down or any purpose whatsoever. And so it grew to an enormous size and was of great age. Now, Zhuangzi is here pulling our legs. He is not exactly asking us to take all that literally, but this is his way of doing things. Then also he describes the behavior of the high form of man. And he says, the man of character, that is, in this case, the word de we were discussing yesterday, the man of character lives at home without exercising his mind and performs actions without worry. The notions of right and wrong and the praise and blame of others do not disturb him. When within the four seas all people can enjoy themselves, that is happiness for him. When all people are well provided, that is peace for him. Sorrowful in countenance, he looks like a baby who has lost its mother. Appearing stupid, he goes about like one who has lost his way. He has plenty of money to spend and does not know where it comes from. He drinks and eats just enough and does not know where the food comes from. This is the demeanor of the man of character. Then by contrast, the hypocrites are those people who regard as good whatever the world acclaims as good and regard as right whatever the world acclaims as right. When you tell them that they are men of Tao, then their countenances change with satisfaction. When you call them hypocrites, then they look displeased. All their lives they call themselves men of Tao, and all their lives they remain hypocrites. They know how to give a good speech and tell appropriate anecdotes in order to attract the crowd. But from the very beginning to the very end, they do not know what it's all about. They put on the proper garb and dress in the proper colors and put on a decorous appearance in order to make themselves popular, but refuse to admit that they're hypocrites. So on. But this explanation of the man who is stupid in countenance and appearance and is wandering about as if he had lost his way and doesn't know anything, of course, is based on the text in Lao Tzu where he says, the people of the world are merrymaking as if partaking of the sacrificial feasts, as if mounting the terrace in spring. I alone am mild, like one unemployed, like a newborn babe that cannot yet smile, unattached like one without a home. The people of the world have enough and to spare, but I am like one left out. My heart must be that of the fool, being muddled, nebulous. The vulgar are knowing, luminous. I alone am dull, confused. The vulgar are clever, self-assured. I alone depressed. Patient as the sea, adrift, seemingly aimless. The people of the world all have a purpose. I alone appear stubborn and uncouth. I alone differ from the other people and value drawing sustenance from the mother. Capital M, that's Mother Nature. So, there is about you see, the character of the Taoist sage as depicted by Zhuangzi, something of the fool. Because the fool is the person who doesn't know enough to come in out of the rain, who doesn't compete. Everybody else gets before him to the prizes, the material prizes of life, and even to the spiritual prizes. The fool is, you see, the person who isn't going anywhere. He sits by the road and goes... The fool is like a Mongolian idiot child who isn't interested in survival, who will take a plate of food and run his finger around in it and make a wonderful slosh with the stew, and then watch it drip from the tip of his finger. He won't eat for quite a while, and then he'll play with it in all sorts of ways. Then his attention will be distracted by something else, and he'll chase after that, you see. But so long as you don't cross him, this is the case of the Mongolian idiot, he remains the most wonderfully friendly, swinging kind of a cat. But he has no ambition. He doesn't fight for himself. And nobody can ever get him to. So the fool has always been used as a kind of analog of the sage. There's a Hindu verse which says, sometimes naked, sometimes mad, now as a scholar, now as a fool, thus they appear on earth, the free men. And if you read the biographies of the early life of Sri Ramakrishna or Sri Ramana Maharshi, they are absolutely wild. Now, not all of this, you see, again, just as in reading Zhuangzi, you mustn't take it too literally. These things are said by way of a kind of overstress to correct another kind of overstress in the opposite direction. When a Japanese scholar many years ago explained the teaching of Buddhism to me, he said something I had never heard anybody else say. That the Buddha taught, for example, that life is suffering in order to correct the wrong view that it ought to be pleasure. He said that everything is impermanent in order to correct the wrong view that reality lasts forever in time. So the idea of the middle way is set up in this fashion by going to one extreme in order to correct another. This is a very common Asian technique, and it is found especially in Zen, where teachers, when they are asked about something sacred, will always answer in terms of something secular. What is the Buddha? The tree in the garden. Then when you ask about something secular, they answer in terms of something sacred. You see? As there's a master and his student working in the field, and they are using a knife to prune, and the student suddenly says to the master, give me the knife. And he gives it to him point first. And so he says, but please let me have the other end. The teacher says, what would you do with the other end? See, the question immediately turns into a kind of a metaphysical thing. So this play back and forth between the extremes has as its interior design the awakening of the mind to polarity that I was talking to you about yesterday, this thing of mutual arising. Zhuangzi tells a story about this. He says a certain keeper of monkeys said with regard to their ration of nuts that each monkey should have 3 in the morning and 4 at night. But at this the monkeys were very angry. So the keeper said they might have 4 in the morning and 3 at night, with which arrangement they were all well pleased. Now the number of nuts was the same, he goes on to say, but there was an adaptation to the likes and dislikes of those concerned. This then, he says, is the way of conduct of the sage. Basically, Zhuangzi's philosophy is a philosophy of relativity. He makes a great deal of the point that there is no absolute standard of great or small, of important or unimportant. There is a story, for example, of a sort of enfant terrible at a banquet, and the speeches are being made after dinner. And somebody gets up and says that the human being is the highest of all creatures, that the whole world serves humanity. And there's a lot of pompous nonsense. The small boy gets up and says that since tigers feed on human beings, it's quite obvious, therefore, that human beings exist for the service of tigers. For Zhuangzi, you must get the point of view that small things are as big things can be, and big things are as small things can be. Everything can be looked at as great or small, important and unimportant, and all the steps between. Because his conception of the world is essentially cyclic. In his idea of the circle, and Taoist and Zen teachers have a whole method of teaching by circles and drawing circles. The center of a circle is any point on the circumference. You can begin anywhere. There's a koan in Zen Buddhism which asks the question, Indra built the seamless tower. Where did he start? Now a seamless tower is like a sleeve with no seam on it. It's a continuous cylinder of cloth. So the continuous cylindrical tower is the seamless tower. Where do you start? So in the same way, where does the circle start? The circle of life, the cycle of life, the interdependence of the bees and the flowers, the interdependence of long and short, you see, it's all circular. And so there is nowhere and there is everywhere that it can begin. In the same way, when he discusses the organs of the body, he makes a catalogue of all these organs and says, now which do you prefer? He says, which one comes first and which one follows? Which one rules and which ones are servants? He said, it seems that there may be a governor in all this, but nobody could ever find it. This is a very strange passage in Zhuangzi, which I've seen translated in many different ways. There is an absolutely absurd translation of Zhuangzi on the market now, published in mentor books by a professor of Chinese at Harvard. And it is absolutely ridiculous. The whole thing is made by a man who is, I'm sure, an ex-missionary, and keeps talking about God. Well, there is no expression in Zhuangzi for God. There is this expression, Tianran, which has almost the same meaning as Ziran, spontaneity of itself so. This means something is so through the power of heaven. Now heaven, Tian, means simply the universe. As you look out from Earth, which is, as it were, the center or the base, everything else, the whole expanse of the cosmos is Tian, heaven. And there is no connection in the idea of heaven with some sort of personal ruler of the universe. So the notion of God, you see, as we understand it, is really very foreign indeed to Taoist thought. And when you see somebody translating this as God, it gives a very wrong impression of this teaching. For example, there is a passage in which Shun asked Zheng, saying, can one get the Tao so as to have it for one's own? And the sage answers, your body is not your own. It is the delegated image of Tian. And, missionaries translate God, because they read in the Bible, man is made in the image of God. Your life is not your own. It is the delegated adaptability of heaven. Your offspring are not your own. They are the delegated seeds of heaven. You move, you know not how. You are at rest, you know not why. These are the operations of the ways of Tao. So how could you get Tao so as to have it for your own? Similarly, there's a passage which says, when a drunk man falls out of a cart, though he may suffer, he does not die. Because his spirit is in a condition of security, He does not suffer from contact with objects of existences. If such security may be got from wine, how much more from being in accord with the spontaneous rhythm of the universe. That's really what it means. But in the anxiety of missionaries, and missionaries have been, you see, the great Western, they've been the foundation of Chinese scholarship in the West. Translate the scriptures into Chinese. They studied Chinese. They were the first people to study Chinese. And they have constantly, therefore, had an interest in slipping Chinese, Christian ideas into Chinese classics, just in the same way as when you read Monia Williams' Sanskrit Dictionary, which is the base dictionary for Sanskrit study for centuries. It's all made up with a missionary bias. But the notion, you see, of God in the sense of the personal ruler of the world is totally foreign to Chinese thought. There isn't even an idea in Chinese thought of the law of nature as we have it. See, the motions of the body, the harmony of the organism, is not what it is in obedience to a law. The Chinese do have an idea of law. This is the word "zi." This is an interesting character, nowadays written this way. But originally written like this. This is a drawing of a sacrificial iron cauldron with a knife beside it. And it comes from a time when the laws were inscribed on the sacrificial cauldrons, so that when people came to offer their sacrifices, they would read the laws. Certain sages objected to this and said that if the people know what the laws are in the fixed terms of writing, they will develop a litigious spirit. That is to say, they'll start haggling about what it really says. And as you know, that is the principal occupation of lawyers. And they said that the thing is that you mustn't write it down like that. And so the Tao is described as Wuzi. We would translate literally lawless. But it means, of course, transcending this kind of law, which is specific law. Positive law, I think, is the correct legal term. So there is no notion in the Taoist philosophy, or one might almost say in Chinese philosophy as a whole, but it certainly includes Confucianism, no notion whatsoever of the world as responding to a boss. So the body, in other words, does not have in it a ruling organ. Its order is the consequence of, or the operation of, every part of it existing together simultaneously, arising mutually. There's no governor. Now, the difficulty, you see, in Zhuangzi's philosophy, the difficulty with human beings is they begin to think in terms of governing and ruling. And they set out to dominate themselves and their surroundings. And invariably this leads to a mess. He tells the story of an ancient man by the name of Polo. Polo was a great horse trainer. This is where we get the word polo from. But he said Polo absolutely ruined the nature of horses. Horses were nice, charming creatures like Dean Swift's Houyhnhnms before polo interfered and ruined their nature. Then he says in other places, a good carpenter doesn't need a square or a compass. He works without it. And this is fantastically true of Japanese carpenters. You should see, one of the fascinating things in going to Japan is these old-style carpenters working from the roughest architectural plans you could imagine, and with the strangest instruments, that they have an uncanny knack of fitting things by feel and by eye. A great story is told of ceremonial raising of the ridgepole of a new temple. And it was being done by a certain guild of carpenters, and there was a rival guild in town which had not got the contract. And they were very sore about it, so during the night, one of the members of the rival guild came, and he chopped off 6 feet or so of the ridgepole. And so when the master craftsman came in the morning and all the priests had arrived for the ceremony of raising the roof beam, he looked at it and said, "Somebody has interfered with this. It must be our enemy guild. They've cut off 6 feet of the roof beam." Anyway, he said, "Never mind, I will put it right." And he took his hammer and ceremonially struck the beam, then said, "Raise it." And it was raised, and it fitted exactly. So, the story is, of course, that the master carpenter knew that this would happen, and he made the beam too long. Those sort of stories are always associated with the art of carpentry. He needs no square, you see, because his sense of skill that is in his organism, in his nerves, in his senses, is much more subtle than anything that can be made with instruments. There are all kinds of stories about the artists of the Far East excelling in this kind of thing, of knowing with tremendous precision exactly where something should go. So a master is decorating a ceremonial tea room, and he's with his student, and the student wants to know where to put a hook for hanging a bamboo vase for flowers on the wall. And the master says, "There," and the student makes a little mark. Somewhat later, the student rubs out the mark, gets rid of it. But he remembers by a tiny little secret prick in the cloth where it should go. And then he says to the teacher, "Excuse me, sir, but I forgot where you said that thing should go." And the teacher says, "It was there," and he puts his finger exactly on the same spot, you see. That's the sort of thing that is admired, without the slightest calculation, you see. Now, he goes on and says, Zhuangzi explains at length that music has been ruined by the 5 notes. He says the 5 notes will make a man deaf, and the 5 colors will make a man blind. Now, what does this mean? The thing is that if you think there are only 5 notes, you can't hear. If you think there are only 5 colors, you can't see. The moment you say, this is a problem that we have in music, that we've got a notation, which is our chromatic scale. And the stave, the way we can write music, is limited to that possibility. But there are all kinds of subtleties between every one of our notes. Same way in writing our rhythm. We have to go in steps from whole note, half note, quarter note, 8th note, 16th note, and so on. And we can increase the value of each by 1/2 by dotting it. But that's the limit of our rhythmic expression. Whereas in all Oriental music, you have an infinite continuum, both of tone and of rhythm. They make the most extraordinarily complicated rhythms. And the way you learn music is not from notation, not from measures, but from the living body of your teacher demonstrating the ways of playing instruments. So you follow the teacher, the man, instead of what it says in a book. So the whole principle then is one of of success in life through not pushing it around, through not trying to govern it. Old man coming out of the forest who fell into the river and suddenly disappeared into the cataract. And he said, "Oh dear, too bad, probably some old fellow tired of life who wants to put an end to it all." The next moment, way downstream, the old man gets out of the water and starts bouncing along. And Confucius is amazed, and he sends one of his disciples to catch this fellow before he disappears. He said, "Sir, I was thinking that you were going to commit suicide, and I suddenly find that you came out of that cataract alive. Do you have some special method by which you do this?" "No, I have no special method," said the old man. "I just go in with the whirl and come out with the swell. Because I don't resist the water, I entirely identify myself with water." So you see, here he is, utterly relaxed, just rolling around in the torrent, and not resisting in any way. And so he is preserved. He goes with the stream, rolls with the punch, or whatever you want to call it. Again, of course, there is exaggeration in a story of this kind. Just as there's exaggeration in the story of the hunchback and the tree and so on. Because true wu-wei, or letting go, non-interference, it doesn't mean, for example, flabbiness. A lot of people, when they think they're relaxing, merely become flabby. And if that is so, the perfectly relaxed person would slowly become jello and would spread out on the floor and finally drip through into the basement. Relaxation, you see, is simply something that happens when there's too much yang in you, too much of the positive. You need to balance off with the yin. And the trouble is that human beings, in their anxiety to control things, exhibit too much yang, too much aggressiveness, too much of the male principle. They need the balance of the female. And so all these exaggerations in the direction of let things go, let things happen, don't interfere, are stressing the yin point of view to compensate for the excess of yang. And furthermore, the difficulty always comes. I remember reading a book called You Must Relax. The difficulty always arises when one feels I must relax, I've got to let go, and let things happen. But how on earth do I do it? Even in trying to relax, I'm all tense because I'm anxious that it must happen, and maybe it won't, and how do you do it, you see? You can't achieve wu-wei like that. What you have to understand is that you don't have to do anything. There is no method, as the old man said. The meaning of Wu Tzu, when you call the Tao is Wu Tzu, or lawless, it means there is no method in it that you can master and do it. What you have, it's all based on understanding, or what our psychologists call insight. That you have to find out that there is nothing that you do as a source and cause of action separate from everything else. When you know that there is no separate acting you, then there is no need to try to relax. The thing you have to see is that the flow of the Tao, as I said yesterday with the illustration of the people swimming in a strong stream, that the flow of the Tao goes on anyway. Just like the flow of time, for example, you can't get out of the present moment. You can think about the past and you can think about the future. But since you do that thinking now, the present is inescapable. All right, now the present moment, it does, doesn't it? It has a sense of flow. Time is going along, life is going along. Time, actually, the clock time, is simply a measure of flow, a way of going tick, 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 and counting the ticks. Say, well, we've lived through so many ticks. But nevertheless, the real time, as distinct from this ticking thing, is a flowing. And yet it's still. Isn't that fascinating? It moves, but you're always there. It's always now. You never get out of now. All right, now, if you can feel that, see, that you can't get out of now, and you never will. See? Now, realize that what we call now is the same thing as Tao. The Tao, the course of things, the eternal now, the presence of God, anything you want to call it. See? That's now, and you can't get out of it. So there's no need to get with it, because you can't get out. See? That's beautiful. You just relax, and you're there. So that's the principle of flowing. You can make all kinds of very clever ways of postponing finding this out. It's terribly simple. That you can say, well, this is a very spiritual matter, and I'm an unevolved person, and it'll take me a great deal of time to realize this in a more than an intellectual way. That's an excuse for playing your own game and not finding this out. There are all sorts of elaborate ways of doing that, and you can put it off by indulging in the most complicated systems of spiritual culture and yoga and so on and so forth. And that's all right. I have no objection to your putting it off if that's what you want to do. But actually, it's always here and now. Just as you can't get away from now, you can't get out of the Tao. But that's the humor of the whole thing. And that's why Zhuangzi has his beautiful light touch. He says, the heron is white without a daily bath. The crow is black without being painted in ink. And this is the same saying, you know, as in Zen. In the spring landscape, there is nothing superior, nothing inferior. Flowering branches grow naturally, some short, some long. Or they say a long thing is the long body of Buddha, a short thing is the short body of Buddha. There are, therefore, you see, blondes and brunettes, fat people and skinny people, tall people and short people, cultured people and vulgar people. Even the Christian hymn says, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. Well, we don't sing that now because we've got too much social content. I think I probably read this passage yesterday. Maybe I didn't. But Zhuangzi has this to say about it. Those who say that they would have right without its correlate wrong, or good government without its correlate misrule, do not apprehend the great principles of the universe, nor the nature of all creation. One might as well talk of the existence of heaven without that of earth, or of the negative principle, yin, without the positive, yang, which is clearly impossible. Yet people keep on discussing it without stop. Such people must be either fools or knaves. Of course, one could always reply to Zhuangzi that there have to be fools and knaves so that we can recognize the existence of sages. Speech is not mere blowing of breath. It is intended to say something, only what it is intended to say cannot yet be determined. Is there speech indeed, or is there not? Can we or can we not distinguish it from the chirping of young birds? How can Tao be so obscured that there should be a distinction of true and false? How can speech be so obscured that there should be a distinction of right and wrong? Where can you go and find Tao not to exist? Where can you go and find that words cannot be proved? The Tao is obscured by our inadequate understanding, and words are obscured by flowery expressions. Hence the affirmations and denials of the Confucian and the Mozian schools, each denying what the other affirms and affirming what the other denies. Each denying what the other affirms and affirming what the other denies brings us only confusion. There is nothing which is not this. There is nothing which is not that. What cannot be seen by that, the other person, can be known by myself. Hence I say, this emanates from that, that also derives from this. This is the theory of the interdependence of this and that. Nevertheless, life arises from death and vice versa. Possibility arises from impossibility and vice versa. Affirmation is based upon denial and vice versa. Which being the case, the true sage rejects all distinctions and takes his refuge in heaven. That's in the universe. For one may base it on this, yet this is also that, and that is also this. This also has its right and wrong, and that has its right and wrong. Does then the distinction between this and that really exist or not? When this, the subjective, and that, the objective, are both without their correlates, that is the very axis of Tao. And when that axis passes through the center at which all infinities converge, affirmations and denials alike blend into the infinite one. Hence it is said that there is nothing like using the light. See, the axis of the opposites is the perception of their polarity. The difference between them is explicit, but the unity of them is implicit. The difference, the explicit difference between two ends of a stick, but the implicit unity that they are ends of the same stick, you see? So that's the axis. The axis of Tao is the, you might call it the secret conspiracy, that it lies between all poles and all opposites, which is implicit, esoteric, or whatever you want to call it, that they're fundamentally one. So that unity, whether it's between you and the universe, or whatever polarity you want to take, is not something that has to be brought into being. If one brings it into being, one assumes that it doesn't exist. That's called in Zen putting legs on a snake, or a beard on a eunuch. There's something unnecessary, you see. So it exists, it is always there, and you can see it so vividly. And actually almost put your finger on it and sense it, if you understand that the movement of the Tao is exactly the same thing as the present moment. Now, of course, if you try to grab the present moment and get ready with your clapper and say, now! It's gone. The finer and finer you draw the hairline on the watch, you don't know exactly when now is. You eventually get to the point where you can't see it at all. See? But if you leave it alone, and you don't try to grab the moment as it flies, but it's always there. See, you don't have to mark it. You don't have to put your finger on it. Because it's everything that there is. And so the present moment suddenly expands. And it contains the whole of time. All past, all future, everything. You never have to hold on.